Thanks everybody for joining us for the next session in our Digital Governance for Democratic Renewal speaker series. This is session 9 titled Access Denied, Barriers to Data Access and Threats to Tech Researchers. Just a background on who I am and what the series is. So my name is Anna Marchese and I'm Senior Project Officer at Columbia World Projects at Columbia University here in New York City. And this virtual speaker series, which is supported by the Knight Foundation, is part of a transatlantic digital governance for democratic renewal initiative. It's organized by Columbia World Projects, the Center for Digital Governance, over at the Hertie School. And the series is organized in partnership with Tech Policy Press. The initiative itself aims to address the challenges generated by digital platforms for democratic institutions and discourse. So since launching in September of 2023, we've brought together over 1,600 digital regulators, technologists, scholars, and civil society advocates to tackle a variety of issues from platform to research frameworks to better diagnose, expose, and address online harms, tools to tackle digital monopolies, and content moderation standards that balance the issues of user privacy, free expression, and community-driven alternatives. So what we're going to be discussing today is really a focus on the threats facing independent tech researchers and really the closing off of data access avenues for those folks. So independent tech researchers serve a vital role scrutinizing how platforms shape public discourse and democratic life. The evidence base they create and sustain leads to meaningful policy interventions and product modifications that lend themselves to safer, more open, and more inviting online spaces. But access to the data independent researchers required to do this work is shrinking, while legal and political pressures are mounting. In December, the State Department imposed visa bans on 5 Europeans under a provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act, normally reserved for security threats, accusing these individuals of leading organized efforts to coerce American platforms to censor, demonetize, and suppress American viewpoints they oppose. This follows an announcement in May 2025 by Secretary of State Marco Rubio of a, quote, new visa restriction policy that will apply to foreign officials and persons who are complicit in censoring Americans. So drawing on a report from Columbia World Projects and the Center for Digital Governance published this past October titled Building Capacity for Data Access, Analysis, and Accountability, today's discussion will look at efforts to expand researcher access to platform data, strengthen platform transparency and accountability, and build sustainable infrastructure for public interest research under existing and emerging regulatory regimes and under pressing threats from the Trump administration. So getting into our participants for today, first off is Mark Scott. Mark is a senior resident fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab's Democracy and Tech Initiative within the Atlantic Council's technology programs. In this role, he's engaged in expanding the initiative's ongoing work around comparative digital policy, regulation, and governance, as well as efforts linked to the European Union's Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. He currently sits on the International Advisory Board of Regulate, a project of the University of Amsterdam dedicated to artificial intelligence policymaking. He's also a research fellow at the Center for Digital Governance at the Hertie School in Berlin and a contributing editor at Tech Policy Press. Next, we have Dr. Courtney Radsch, who is director of the Center for Media and Digital Governance at the Open Markets Institute, where she produces and oversees cutting-edge research into the political economy of AI, news media market structures, and information power, and helps design smart policy solutions that protect democracy and human liberty. As a global thought leader, she regularly publishes and provides commentary and analysis in top media outlets, keynotes, and moderates events around the world, and advises publishers and media leaders. She has testified before congressional, parliamentary, and competition authorities in several countries and advised international organizations, including the UN, EU, OECD, OSCE, and WEF. She's also a board member of Tech Policy Press. And then finally, we've got Brandi Geurkink, who is the executive director of the Coalition for Independent Technology Research, or CITR. Prior to the coalition, she led advocacy campaigns at the Mozilla Foundation for policies to improve independent researcher access to data and open source auditing of consumer technology platforms in Europe and the United States. At Mozilla, she created YouTube Regrets, the world's largest community-driven audit of YouTube recommendation algorithms, which has won multiple awards. Previously, Brandi also directed a research team and advised on the technology portfolio of Reset Tech, a nonprofit philanthropic organization dedicated to restoring the critical connection between media and democracy. Before working on corporate accountability in the technology sector, she was an organizer and campaigner with the International Civil Society Center in Berlin and the One Campaign in Washington, D.C. So Mark, Courtney, Brandi, thank you so much for joining us today. And I just want to kick things off with a very general question, which is, could you guys give us an overview of the current state of independent access to platform data and really discuss the most pressing threats as you see them facing the independent technology researchers today, just with reference to the work that you're doing? So I think I'll toss it to Brandi first, and then we'll go down the line.
Sure. Thank you, Anna. The most pressing threats that are facing independent technology researchers today are stemming from this convergence of the concentrated power of billionaires and trillionaires in Silicon Valley and authoritarian political leaders. The shared strategy that is emerging from that convergence is really threefold. It is to dismantle existing regulations that support individuals' rights to privacy and agency, to prevent new regulation that distributes power or creates any routes towards greater accountability, or to create new regulations and technologies that power pervasive surveillance and push towards an agenda that is in opposition to democracy and human rights. A core tactic within that strategy is to undermine dissent and accountability in all of its forms. And so, in the context of this conversation, that means making critical research and reporting impossible, risky to do, work that is really under attack. So, in layman's terms, this gap between the billionaire and trillionaire class of Silicon Valley and the people who live underneath in the systems that they build and operate has never been bigger. And research and reporting that challenges either dominant industry narratives, that sheds a light on how these systems harm people or violate our rights, or in any way informs efforts towards accountability, whether that is by regulators, by litigators, by people who take to the streets and protest, that work is under attack. And I know we're going to go into some of what that looks like concretely. I also want to plug that our coalition puts out an annual report that is called the State of Independent Tech Research Report that really looks at some of these trends more concretely through the lens and through the voices of researchers who are on the ground doing that work. But I thought that it's really important to start off my framing remarks with that overall context of where we're at in 2026 and why we're there and who it is that we are actually up against as part of this kind of overall strategy that's being pursued, because that shapes everything else that is going to flow from this conversation today.
Great. Thanks so much, Brandi. Courtney, over to you. Oh, Courtney, I believe you might be muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's hard to improve on Brandi's really excellent overview, and it is this fusion of concentrated corporate power over our information communication systems and the very underlying, from the platforms, now the AI systems that we use to receive and impart information, that we use to form decisions, and the increasing collusion with an increasingly fascist regime here in the United States. We're typically, I think, talking about American platforms as opposed to Chinese platforms, but either it's dominated either by a corporatist or statist system, both of which are increasingly anti-democratic. So I don't want to reiterate, but say those are absolutely, I think that is the biggest threat right now. And I want to add an additional element, which is in the need now for tech research to understand how these artificial intelligence systems, whether we're talking about large language models or AI assistants, AI agents, the way that all of this is now being very forcefully and integrated into the systems that we use to communicate, to shop, to do politics, is an even bigger challenge than it was in the social media age and the search age, because it's even more opaque. It's even less understandable. There are, in in the United States, we have virtually no data access laws, with the exception of some states. And now we're in a system where there's so much more data, and it's not only that we don't have access or the rights to access that data, but we are being force-fed these systems, right? Because you have these existing concentrated power over parts of our information system, whether we're talking about the platforms that we use to email, or that we use to produce writing, or that we communicate with, the social media platforms, search, all of these are dominated by a very small handful of these same corporate tech actors. And so this is becoming, I think, a very existential challenge, because they are now forcing these products into all of these daily tools that we use, our word processing, our search, et cetera. And we have really no way to gather data. I would also add that in addition to the opaqueness, these systems are shaping what we know and how we know in ways that we have not yet figured out how to even study. So we face an access to data crisis and this epistemological crisis of how we even are going to know what we know. And with the threats against independent researchers, not just the threats, but the actual harms that have been caused, as well as the threats, there's a silencing. I think there's also an increased dependency on whistleblowers, particularly in AI. And the Signals Network has, I've talked to the executive director there about how the whistleblowers coming from AI companies have increased, in tech companies. That is putting everyone at great risk. And so, as the access to data, if we think, we typically think about data as like digits and figures, but also, human data is important. But you've got so many people who have to sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, in order to do research. You've got, the companies are using socioeconomic conditions to coerce people into silence, to prevent them from whistleblowing, paying very little but very important wages in some contexts. So there's a whole factor of like socioeconomic and political economy of this situation, in addition to the core issues that Brandi laid out earlier.
Thanks so much for laying that out, and for the inclusion of human generated data in this process. I think that's really a point that gets missed a lot of the time. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Anna. It's always great to go last after two wonderful speakers. So forgive me, I'm trying to won't try and duplicate what has already been said. As a think tanker, you'd expect me to be a little bit technocratic, so forgive me a little bit. Before I joined the Atlantic Council, I was a journalist for 20 years, and most of my work focused primarily on trying to find information on social media around election-related harm and moving into other types of harm, particularly during the COVID-19 crisis. It became progressively more difficult to just get access to that data. What does that mean? If I wanted to see what was being surfaced, say, in Germany, in terms of what was being discussed on social media around an election, it became more difficult to see that, to find out, and to sort of figure out what was going on. Some of the people who would suggest that is sort of censorship, etc., miss the point. This is all public information. We are looking at things that people are putting up on social media in the public forum. But it's also important for the public discourse, per Courtney's perspective, mostly because a lot of the conversation we are now having around politics, around social issues, is going to be happening on TikTok. It's going to be happening now via Claude and OpenAI and ChatGPT. So we need to be aware that this isn't just some sort of other. It is part of the public discourse. It's part of the public space, and that is just being progressively shut down and not being able to be accessed over the last, say, 3 to 5 years. Now, Brandi mentioned the words transparency and accountability, and this, I think, for me, is the central part of what this conversation for me is about. We can't know what we don't know. And I would argue that in 2026, despite the fact that social media remains a primary driver of news, information, and how we talk to each other, and not let alone the LLMs that are popping up, we know less about what goes on these platforms now than we did 5 years ago, leaving aside the LLMs. That's a problem. It's a problem not just for us in Western countries. It's definitely a problem in the global South, where the access to this information is crucial, particularly when countries maybe do not have the same length of democratic norms and institutions that we are very grateful to have in Western countries. Again, knowing what's being said, how it's being said, who's being saying it, is it coming from internal actors, is it coming from foreign actors, is there money involved? All these things go directly to how democracy works in 2026. If we don't have that information, leaving aside the excellent point that the two previous speakers said, just for the basic facts of being access to that information to make informed decisions about who to vote for, how not to click on the financial scam that may be sent to you, all these basic things of how society works in 2026. If we don't have access to information to understand how these systems work, we can't make informed decisions. And without informed decisions, without being too apocalyptic, so democracy fails, because that's the whole point. We need to be able to know who's saying what, where, and how to make a judgment if that information is useful and credible to ourselves. And so I'll stop, but I think for me, it is about accountability. It's about transparency, but more importantly, it's about the ability for individuals in any country in the world to know what's happening to them, why it's happening to them, so they can make an informed decision. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So I now have a few follow-up questions for each of you. And before going into them, I just want to let everybody know in the audience that we'd love for you to use the chat liberally to pose questions, as well as within the Q&A function. You can do that as well, or just share work that you've been doing that is relevant to this discussion. But going back into follow-up, Brandi, I'd love to hear more about kind of how the administration's censorship policy has impacted the research community. And I'm using this very deliberately because, CITR has filed a lawsuit back in March challenging the State Department policy that allows the deportation or denial of visas for non-citizen researchers studying online harms. That was mentioned at the kind of beginning of this session. Could you just provide us with an overview of this lawsuit and how it came about?
Absolutely. And I also just want to speak briefly about the coalition. So I know there's lots of coalition members here on the call today. Great to see everyone. The Coalition for Independent Technology Research is a coalition of now more than 550 independent researchers, including academics, civil society researchers, journalists, community scientists, who organize in defense of the right to carry out industry independent research about technology. And our coalition is, as you mentioned, Anna, currently suing the United States government, including the Department of State and Department of Homeland Security, for unconstitutionally targeting non-citizen researchers, fact checkers, trust and safety workers with visa denials, revocations, detention, and even deportation based on their work researching and reporting on social media platforms. So under a policy introduced last year, the government is censoring people whose work involves a whole host of keywords: combating misinformation, disinformation, false narratives, fact-checking, content moderation, trust and safety, compliance in the online sphere. So this includes researchers, scientists, nonprofit staff who are trying to understand how big tech and AI companies are affecting people's lives. These are everyday people who are doing their jobs to independently investigate social media and AI's impact on children, digital surveillance, biased algorithms, and more. And, this policy has had a chilling effect on coalition members, specifically on non-citizens who are just trying to do their jobs. And we brought this lawsuit because this policy violates our First Amendment rights. We're currently awaiting a decision on our motion for a preliminary injunction, which would halt the government from implementing this policy against the public interest research community while the litigation proceeds, so that scientists and students and nonprofit workers can continue to do their jobs. And one of the things that has become clear through this litigation so far is, just because you asked, Anna, how this policy is impacting the research community, is just how broad and vague and far-reaching the government's policy really is. And I think that some people have interpreted this in the broader context of attacks on scientific research in the United States and elsewhere, avoiding certain keywords that could trigger retaliation or pushback. And then others, and this we see especially in the case of junior researchers or those who are in more precarious situations altogether, is to avoid certain areas of work entirely. And the entire point of a chilling effect is to make it unclear who or what is now prohibited. Because when you do that, you create this power dynamic between the researcher who's doing their work and the person who gets to decide whether or not that work is okay or whether or not that work is allowed. And that is the purpose in the chilling effect. It's not about the work. It's to create that power dynamic. It's to create that mother may I situation that keeps people in a position of fear, in a subordinate position in relation to the government. And that dynamic is exactly what the First Amendment is meant to protect against, which is government censorship of speech. And so that is really at the core of our lawsuit, is defending our rights to free speech, the rights of the research community, journalists, trust and safety workers, and everyone else who's really impacted by this extremely vague and broad policy of censorship that the government is pursuing.
Great, thank you. I mean, one of the things as I was reading through the lawsuit that really stood out to me is just how much of a people use whole of government approach. It feels like a full court press these censorship accusations have become during the second Trump administration. So it's not only the State Department, you've got the FTC, the DOJ, the House Judiciary Committee, all launching investigations and lawsuits around the claim that platforms, tech researchers, the community that you're within are engaging in acts of censorship. Courtney, I wanted to hop over to you because you've written about the lawsuit itself and what you're calling the censorship inversion with respect to what all of this represents. So could you provide us with a breakdown of what you mean when you say censorship inversion, just to kick things off?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's what really stands out about this administration is I'm going to have to use a word that I think was overused in 2016, but it's truly Orwellian. Because one of the concepts, it's very important, our ability to understand things, to enact, democracy, be citizens, is that we can talk about things and that the words we use have some reference to the empirical reality that they are describing. And so what we see with this administration from day one, when Trump signed his executive order on, freedom of speech, is that they're using the concept of freedom of speech to restrict freedom of speech. And they are claiming censorship when they're actually restricting, they're claiming censorship when other people are actually using their freedom of speech. So it's a total inversion of the concept. And what that does is it makes it, it's really difficult in some ways to fight back because you are forced to engage in this fight that is senseless. Literally, it does not make sense to call independent researchers and regulators who are enacting or studying content moderation or digital regulation or digital markets, sort of legislation as censors. That is not what censorship is. But then on the other hand, you literally have the administration censoring people and retaliating against them for their speech, whether we're talking about the independent researchers denied access to the US and their visas revoked, whether you're talking about pro-Palestinian supporters, whether you're talking about critical late night hosts. I mean, the gamut is wide and it goes very far. And so this is the inversion, the censorship inversion. Furthermore, you now have this, they're using a technique that was wielded against, say, like George Soros, and we saw this in Hungary and Poland in their democratic declines, to weaponize the idea of civil society, of independent research, of independent academia. Obviously, we've seen the crackdown on academia here, right? It's not just that you're seeing the censorship inversion and the attack on researchers, there are attacks on the entire academic institutions, right? We're seeing funding cut. We're seeing departments shut down. We're seeing the power of the government being used to shape what speech academic organizations and researchers and professors, et cetera, can even engage in. And so I think, this is something that we have to realize, like this particular focus of the CITR lawsuit is emblematic of a much broader crackdown on free speech, on access information. And, we concurrently happening along with this is not only are they trying to restrict the ability to study what's happening with the corporate platforms, this administration is also deleting and preventing access and collection of data that is supposed to be public data provided by the government, right? So you have, the deletion of a lot of data that used to be publicly accessible. You have the closure of data gathering efforts. There's something I think going on with the oceans right now. So there's just all sorts of issues. And I would add one other thing that I didn't mention in the opening remarks, but I think that is also relevant, is around the corporate influence over tech research, which is it's very difficult to find institutions, organizations, and researchers doing independent tech research that do not have funding from the corporations that they're trying to study. And that is very challenging because everyone's competing for the same bucket of funds, and it shapes what questions you ask. I don't want to imply that everyone who gets funding from a tech platform, every organization is not doing great work. Some of them are, some of them aren't, some of them are certainly shills. But it will shape what investigations are you doing? What questions are you asked? How are you going about doing that analysis? And I think that it's very important to realize that that is another way of undermining independent tech research. And, as you've had all these cuts to to independent scholarly research, to USAID and Department of State, which used to fund some of this type of research around the world, that's another crackdown on independent research. That is further, on the human side of the people and organizations that are able to do that research. And so it's, this idea that somehow a handful of civil society organizations and independent researchers are engaged in this massive industrial level censorship is literally a description of what the Trump administration is doing through its evisceration of funding and organizations that support independent research, through the jawboning of platforms, through the direct threats and retaliation against independent researchers.
Thanks, Courtney. One of the things that really stood out to me, again, going through that lawsuit was, we're talking about threats to researchers and the closure of access to data that they need to do very necessary analysis. And it's somewhat intuitive that they go hand in hand, but it's not always obvious. But where it becomes increasingly obvious is really looking at those targeted by this administration's censorship policy that includes the co-founder of Hate Aid, Anna Lenoven-Hodenberg. The rationale provided for her sanctioning was Hate Aid's petition to expand data access for researchers under the Digital Services Act. Per a tweet from Undersecretary of State Sarah Rogers, Hate Aid, quote, routinely demands access to proprietary social media data to help it censor more. Mark, you've been doing so much work on, looking at independent researchers' existing avenues for accessing platform data and how these have changed in recent years and ways in which we can strengthen them. I'm wondering if you can tell us, what is Rogers getting at here? And then, if anything's been missing in terms of this discussion so far, what people ought to know about existing avenues for accessing platform data.
No, thanks. I also should be transparent that I'm also a CITR member. So just, hello to everyone on the call who is also a member. It's difficult. I don't want to speak specifically to the Heyday case. Let's just talk more generally. There is a sense that the researchers who are doing this work, and I would put myself in this category, are sort of using skullduggery, if you will, to get access to sort of proprietary technology to find out who we should censor, right? Who's doing the bad stuff so we can turn them. That's not how any of this works. Like, none of us have that power. We are independent researchers, but also the online safety rules that are providing some of this access, they're not set up for this. They're set up for, I mean, it sounds boring and wonky and geeky, but they are transparency and accountability tools. They're not there to sort of tell, create a ministry of truth or to tell people what they shouldn't say online. It is basically trying to figure out how these systems work so we can make informed decisions. That's literally all they can do. There's no conspiracies behind it. It's just that. Um, and so the idea that and I would just, as a transatlanticist, I would also say some of these attacks are coming from Europe, not just in the US. Unfortunately, this is not a US phenomenon; it's a global phenomenon that Courtney describes. That although the US maybe has its own peculiarities currently, this is about trying to shut down the ability for independent researchers like those in Brandi's coalition to give citizens a say on what is going on around them. We are living in an increased corporatized world. It is what it is. We all use these platforms that are owned by these very large and wealthy corporations. But to understand what is going on in those systems is fundamental. The problem is, again, I'm trying not to repeat myself, is that this doesn't happen currently. So if I'm an independent researcher or even an academic or someone from the public, how do I know the algorithm that is shown to me on TikTok? How do I know how that's created and what I'm being surfaced? Is it all the information that I should be seeing? Is it a small slither? Are they targeting me based on my gender, my location, my interests? Data that's been pulled from other data sources that they can buy off the shelf to more target the information towards me. That is all, I think, valid grist for the mill in to understand how democracy works in 2026. So that system doesn't work at the moment. It's fallen down and broken down for a variety of different reasons. One of them being most of the platforms becoming increasingly adversarial in anyone asking questions that sort of chips away at sort of these black boxes of how these systems currently work. And so some of the work that actually you, Anna, were also involved in last year was trying to figure out how this works. I will leave the advocacy to those who are better placed. My job is to try and make sure that those researchers doing the good work have access and in a cost-effective, meaningful way. And what we found currently is that's not working. It's just not working. There's a variety of reasons why, which can get into that in a minute. So I can put a link to the report that we did in the chat. But it comes down to three things: money. There's never enough of it. Access. There's not enough of it. And just the ability to do the work without being attacked, per what Courtney and Brandi says, is becoming harder no matter where you look. And that's not just in the US. And so those three, the trifecta, just make it difficult to give citizens a great understanding and awareness of what's happening. To Courtney's point, we are now progressively moving from the ability of Brandi's members to do the research to provide that either directly to public or via journalism or advocacy, to a growing reliance on whistleblowers, because without the ability to access data in any other forms, it comes down to people who work for these platforms, who've seen things going on, to share that information publicly via the whistleblower structure to give people a sense of what's going on. And that's great. And those people are doing work that is needed to improve transparency, accountability, but it doesn't scale as much as the whistleblowers keep coming forward, and for very legitimate reasons. That doesn't allow a systematic approach to giving people a greater say in what's going on in these platforms, because it is reliant on the goodwill of those working inside the companies to see something that isn't right and to make it public. And that should hopefully continue, but there needs to be a more systematic way of doing this. So the information that is provided by these platforms isn't just relied on an ad hoc banner.
Thanks so much, Mark. I have a very quick follow-up for you, which is in the report that came out that was really kind of a joint effort between CWP and CDG and involved the folks on this call and was really spearheaded by you, Mark. It stresses that funders, regulators, and researchers need to act within the next 6 to 12 months to establish foundational data access infrastructure and standards related to all of this. And then without swift action, democratic institutions are vulnerable to the weaponization of social media platforms whose activities remain opaque and subject to potential manipulation by malign actors. We're now 8 months out from the publication of the report. So I want you to give us a little bit of a status update of what, if any, recommendations have been taken up by whom, and what are some barriers to the recommendations that potentially have not really been taken into consideration or acted upon.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we are living in a beautiful world where there's money flowing from the trees and everything's been fixed. That unfortunately has not happened. So to break it down very briefly, there were three recommendations that we had from this report. One was to help build the infrastructure to make this work at a mass scale. Provide capacity building to researchers to make sure they are doing this appropriately and within the right ethical guidelines. And then thirdly, provide a greater connection between the online safety regulators who are doing some of this mandatory work now in terms of oversight and the researchers who are providing the lion's share of that work. Not to say that researchers become reliant or beholden to regulators, but that find the right research to the right people at the right time. None of it has happened, or almost none of it has happened. And there's a variety of reasons why we get into. The one thing I would shout out is the European Commission have just launched a €6 million tender opportunity to build some of this infrastructure that's outlined in the report, and that's very much a useful component of this. But 6 million is a drop in the bucket in terms of the amount of money required to do this at scale and to provide the independence, to Courtney's perspective, so researchers are not taking money for the companies who are they also looking to oversee. There's someone in the chat mentioned about philanthropy. I'd love to see them step further up into the space. There's been similar attacks from the researchers has also gone after the philanthropy for a variety of different reasons. But also there's been a pivot to the AI craze. Everyone is kind of moved away from platform governance and has been moving into the AI space. There's obviously an overlap there, but it just has reduced the ability or willingness for some funders to put money into ongoing research into what they've been funding for years. And then the third point would be, it's a hard, I mean, I hate to bring this too mercenary, but money does count in this space, and the ability to invest in the infrastructure, invest in the independence of researchers, and invest in those meaningful long-term relationships so that researchers can import their great work to the regulators who are doing some of the oversight. That is I'm going to be diplomatic and say that is a work in progress as we get to the second half of 2026.
Courtney, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that because I think that's a good point. And as we think about, like, it's not just about funding the research, which is very important. We are now in an ecosystem where you also need to think about the safety and preparedness of those researchers, right? For online harassment, for legal challenges, for strategic lawsuits against public participation, known as SLAPs. I mean, it's a broader environment. You need to plan for that type of support. I think that looking at, as we mentioned, whistleblowers, now you need whistleblower support. That's a whole increasing domain. A lot of the data that we've seen being used by people to understand how platforms are responding to harm has come from whistleblowers releasing reams of information. That is a lot to ask somebody to, put their line and their career on the line. So, I think, I hope that one thing that philanthropy takes away from this is just how important it is to democracy, to our world, our economy, our society, that we understand how these platforms shape our world, they shape our politics, and all of that. And I would say double down where there is on organizations that are trying to do research without the support of platforms or without the support of government, because that is an important part of the independent mix, right? You need the independent research. And again, sometimes you can only do research because you are working with a platform to get access to certain types of data. That will tell you some things and you will be able to ask certain questions, but not others. So I would just +1 to everything Mark said and wanted to add that additional point.
Thank you. We're now at this point where we're going to transition to Q&A, and we've been getting tons of really good questions, both in the chat and the Q&A function. So I'm going to pose one of these questions, Brandi, first to you, because I'd love to bring you back in. But in general, it's a question for everybody. This is from Athan Mazoris. Why do you think the situation has gotten so much worse in the last few years? Is it caused by changes in tech? In other words, better anti-scraping measures, shifting economic incentives caused by AI, making platforms more defensive about their data, increased threat of regulation, so on and so forth? So, Brandi, please.
Yeah, thanks. I think that it is going back to my comments that I said at the beginning, this convergence of technological and political power. I think earlier on we were talking, briefly about the role that X has played in all of this, and certainly they have taken the most publicly aggressive stance against researchers. Here you have a trillionaire, the wealthiest person in the world, making sure that researchers and journalists cannot shine a light on what his companies, especially X, are up to. And, Musk has done that by cutting off access to data, escalating that by filing lawsuits against public interest researchers, as well as using his position within the Trump administration to retaliate against people who he is ultimately afraid of. But I think what is interesting is this way in which Musk and X then pave the way for other tech companies, especially those which have historically at least tolerated independent research and reporting, and in general, efforts towards greater accountability, to become much more aggressive in their posturing against independent researchers, the research community, and their posturing in favor of the efforts of the Trump administration to act as really a political arm of Silicon Valley. So I think that, I would go back to that convergence of political and technological power and say that I don't believe that it is a result of advancements in technology at all. I think it is a political maneuver.
Great, thank you. Another question we've got is, as we transition from social media platforms to AI agents integrated into our daily tools, are traditional data access methods like API still relevant? Or do we need a completely new definition of what data access means for researchers? I'm going to toss this out to anyone, so please feel free.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in on that. First, I think that we have to recognize data access tends to be thought of a little bit narrowly, but I think we should acknowledge that we need all types of data access. So you need to understand inputs, access to outputs, to display, and I would even argue throughout that process, because for example, when you're studying social media algorithms, you can figure out some of what the algorithm is trained to do by working backwards, and based on what the results are, right? It's much more difficult with AI systems to do that because of the combination of personalization with these very large language models undergirding them, and then the inference, and we don't have transparency into any of those processes. So I do think we need to, for Mark's point, continue to study the platforms and social media, et cetera, because those have not gone away. And we need to develop new ways of studying AI inputs, outputs, and the process in between. And I just want to throw out an idea that, as the AI companies have claimed the right to all of the data that we have ever produced and put online in order to build these tools, maybe they should be required to provide full access to their data in exchange for that free use and what many would call theft of our data to build these tools. Just a thought.
Thanks, Courtney. I've got another follow-up question, and that last question came from Anas Ahmed Abdallah, so thank you for that. This next one comes from Valeria Pomega, who is asking, I would be interested to hear whether there are platform data access rights similar to those established under Article 40 of the DSA in any US state pieces of legislation. Mark, I'll toss that to you, but that's also an open question for everyone.
Oh, it's a tough one because I'm not a US state legislator expert. I mean, there's stuff going on at the federal level through PATA that is kind of stalled and it's been stalled for years. There are transparency mechanisms built into some of the state-based rules. They're not the same as the DSA, but just be very clear, the DSA data access rules are not the panacea that many of us would have liked them to be either. So just be careful with what you wish for. The Brits are also are doing stuff on data access, and this should be again. There should be sort of more news on that in the autumn and the fall about that. So yeah, there are pockets of data access going on, particularly when it comes to some of the AI transparency legislation that's coming in the US states. There are the effort to they're not the same, but they are the effort to sort of shed greater light on how these systems work. But it's very piecemeal. As everything in the US, it would be so much easier if there was a federal effort something around this. But again, the digital policy making in Congress is stalled, and again, I'm trying to be diplomatic with that at best. So currently, the DSA is what we have. The others are looking to follow suit, but it's very much we're the beginning of the process, not the end of it.
Great, thanks. On the U.S. front, there was a question about the Jawbone Act that Ted Cruz and Ron Wyden have proposed, and I think I'll skip over that, but I think that is something that's very important to look into. So thanks for the question about that. I have one that was submitted in advance of this webinar from Zoe Titus. Should access to platform data be understood as a justice issue rather than simply a transparency issue? That can go for anyone.
I mean, I guess that's kind of embedded in my suggestion that, they have extracted this data from people. And I think our ability and certainly the level of complicity that many of them, as was pointed out, there are these vast socioeconomic differences, vast geographical distances. If we think about the role that, a handful of American tech firms play globally. So I think it's a justice issue on many levels and a transparency issue. But I think that the reason you hear transparency as the primary focus is that certainly in this administration and many jurisdictions, social justice is not actually a priority.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, not to sort of mimic what Courtney has said, but there are two issues here. Yes, it's a justice issue, but it's also the way the rules work currently, particularly when it comes to online safety regimes that have been set up to provide some of this access. They are transparency and accountability regulation. It is the rules that say this, right? So we could, yes, there are some very legitimate justice reasons why, to what Courtney and Brandi said, that we as citizens who provide all this information to social media should be able to access it for our own purposes. But that's a legitimate discussion to have. But from a frankly technical and forgive me think tanky perspective, we also need to be clear that the reason why accountability is used is because the online safety regimes that we have available to us currently are accountability regimes. So it's from a legal perspective, accountability is the framing because that is what allows for the mandatory data access under the DSA, for example. That there are specific reasons why it's framed this way because it's the legal cover required to give the data access that is being asked for.
I'm going to piggyback off of this with another question that was just asked, and I'm going to pair it with another question as well. So from Wendy Pringle, for countries with new legislation following in the steps of the EU's DSA today, what lessons from past experiences should they be learning for the setup of a data access regime? And then we've got something from Jared Bankied, who says, can you discuss the geopolitical US v East Asia implications of your recommendations?
I'll take the first one, mostly because if there are any British regulators or officials on this call, please listen up because they're the next ones that are in line to do this. Don't just copy paste the DSA. Just don't do that. You see it as a sort of DSA 2.0 or whatever, OSA 2.0 or whatever the version of rules you're looking at. There are some good things in terms of definitions and how things procedurally can work within data access within the DSA, but we should be very clear the public data access regime within the DSA that's been going for sort of 18, 24 months, it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked at scale and a variety of reasons. And please connect with me afterwards and I'll happily give you the very, very boring reasons why. On the more private-centered data that is coming. It just started, and I think there's been 49 applications to access that data, none of which have been successful yet. And there's a very good technical reasons why, and that's no shade on the Irish regulator who's overseeing that. It's just it hasn't happened yet. So if I was starting from scratch in Brazil or Australia or Indonesia, fill in blank country, I would look at what has worked within the DSA, keep the good bits, but then look to improve on it, to reduce the cost, reduce the complexity, and provide greater access at scale to those who need it most.
I mean, I might just add, in addition to that, I think that we need to look at the importance of data access is not just about content moderation issues, right? We need to look at data access and the whole tech platform AI governance ecosystem, right? So I think we need to expand, if you are looking at like a Digital Services Act type legislation, what you're thinking about in terms of the type of data and where that might come from, as well as thinking about how could you make that once data has been provided, particularly if it is, say, non-sensitive and could be useful for others, like are there data repositories? What is the definition of researcher versus other types of interests, like, journalists or whatever. So I think there are, I'm sure Mark is much better situated to respond to that. But I saw that there's this question about equating big media and big tech companies and
yes,
cutting
please.
off
I was going to toss that to you. If you want to read it out, that'd be great.
Okay, sure. So Derek Slater is saying big media companies are also cutting off public interest research, including use of automated processes to collect data on public media and use of archives like the Internet Archive. Media companies' legal arguments here mirror the tech companies. How might we better join up researchers in both these spaces and tailor solutions accordingly? Whether it is Musk or Murdoch, Bezos, the Amazon owner, or Bezos, the Washington Post owner, there are shared interests here. So I think that the interest of being able to conduct public interest research online, first of all, those big media companies are not public media. So public media refers to government funded media with independent editorial controls. So I think making sure that there is access to public media for public interest research is important. That is different than saying corporate media should make sure that their media is available for public access interest. And I actually don't think that there's an elision of interests here. I think that what we're seeing is that in this refusal of tech companies to have either consent for the data that they gather, to pay compensation for the data that they gather, that they are leading to the closure of the open web. And so publishers cannot afford to gather news, create entertainment, develop books, et cetera, for free. And so they are deciding that in the face of this non-consensual scraping, to block bots, because there are no regulations or laws around how to differentiate between text and data mining for public interest research versus corporate research. And we saw, for example, with the EU, which tried to distinguish between that. You have OpenAI, which started as like a nonprofit, and it's now almost $1 trillion for-profit company. So I think we have to update also our approach to how we do public interest research, what that actually means, and how we can continue to provide this important. We need information, but that's where this idea of independent research and the differentiation of what that research is going to be used for. If you're building competing products, if you're building an entire information system built on the extraction and uncompensated use of the underlying information, then you're not going to be able to afford to create new information. So, I mean, it's really complicated here, but I think that one way we could do this is to go into more of an opt-in approach. So you have to opt in to web crawling. And I think that fundamentally what we're seeing is tech research is changing. We cannot use a lot of these tools are not going to be available any longer. I mean, Internet Archive, amazing resource. On the other hand, they also are being used by the big AI companies to create They're trillion-dollar products. None of that money is going back to all of those of us who provide the information, whether you're talking about the individual or the publisher level. So I think that's another added complexity to how we do research in the age of AI as independent tech researchers.
Thanks, Courtney. I'm going to take back my moderator privileges because we've got 5 minutes to go. And we do have tons and tons of really fantastic questions that are still coming in. But I'm going to just ask this final question for you all, a bit of a lightning round on best and worst case scenarios. So say 2 years from now, if we fail to solve both sides of this issue, and I'm taking that to be barriers to data access and growing pressures and threats to independent researchers, what is the future of platform accountability going to look like? On the flip side, what would success involve? So yeah, Brandi, I might toss that to you first.
Okay.
Not to put
start.
but any pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. I'm going to start with the worst case so that I can end with the best case. Worst case, I think, is honestly, it's a continuation. It's a continuation of this concentration of, and convergence of technological and political power, where surveillance capabilities are going to expand faster than accountability. Independent research will continue to be chilled through legal and financial pressure, and our abilities to challenge dominant narratives coming from industry become impossible. And in that world, institutions that are really meant to check powerful actors are going to end up as their arms and their instruments, just in the moment when AI systems become even more pervasive in all of our lives. Okay, sorry, got that out of the way. The best case scenario is that in 2 years, we see this rebalancing of power. That's what it's about, in my view. It's about independent researchers, journalists, civil society groups, retaining but also expanding our ability to scrutinize frontier AI systems. We see courts and regulators establishing meaningful accountability mechanisms, and the public, people maintaining strong individual rights to privacy and agency online, and our ability to have democratic oversight. So, which path that we end up on does not depend on the technical trajectory of the AI industry. It is going to depend on whether or not society preserves the conditions for independent scrutiny and democratic governance. And I think that best case scenario, it's worth saying, is going to require all of us to fight for it. It's not going to happen on its own.
Thank you. Mark, over to you.
So I'm typically a pessimist, so I'm going to go pessimistic first and then use Brad as an example and go optimistic second. The pessimistic view, I think, just from a very personal level, is that people give up. The chilling effect is real, that people realize there's no funding support available, and they decide to take their incredible, wonderful expertise to other sectors or bow out of this space. And that would be a massive shame, both for those individual researchers and their careers, but also just for the wider societal benefit that I would argue that public interest research does at scale. So in terms of chilling effect, funding support, complexity of accessing the data in a variety of forms, that would be the worst case, that people just give up. 2 years' time, I'm going to go less swinging for the fence. I'm going to throw some doubles and singles out there versus Brandi's home run. I would hope that we would see people, many of whom are part of the CITR coalition, share their knowledge. I get the fight. I get that is definitely, but I think the way we do this is by supporting each other. And therefore, in 2 years' time, the ability for those who've got data access via the DSA to support others to make those applications, the policymakers from, say, the EU, working with other jurisdictions and not just those from the West to create regimes that are similar but improved, to share that knowledge, to realize that this isn't just about proprietary intel so I can get the best tenure position at a university. This is about sharing what we know, supporting each other, and through that sort of coalition capacity building, I think we move the ball forward.
Thank you. Courtney, you get the last word.
Okay, well, in addition to, I think, a lot of what Brandi and Mark laid out on the pessimistic side stands, but I want to then take it one step beyond, because this isn't just about our ability as researchers. This is about the human, political, and economic costs of what happens if we don't have this research. It means that anyone running a business or who's a content creator or influencer is beholden to opaque decisions by platforms that they have no insight or control over, or ability to advocate for different policies. And we just saw, with some of the changes that I think Spotify has put out for smaller producers with less streamers. This has real economic implications. It has real political implications. We will have no idea what type of information is being algorithmically amplified, why certain viewpoints are. I mean, unless Musk happens to tweet about how he doesn't like the answers that Grok's getting, we will have no idea why certain outputs are being shown to people, who's getting that, how that may or may not be influencing political decision making and other types of decision making. We will not be able to have the evidence that we need to pursue these product liability trials and get justice when these products are really even fatally harmful. So there are massive human and societal costs to the inability to do this research. And so I think I want to end with, I'll try on an optimistic note, is that if we get it right, it means that we are more empowered as a citizenry, that we are able to leverage Mark's lovely idea of collectiveness and collective action to actually then translate that into improving the experience of what the industry calls users and what we call citizens or humans, right? And that's ultimately what this is about. That it will also detract from the tech companies' ability to completely shape and dominate the narrative with their version of reality, so that we can have an alternate perspective. And I think that is, it's important for us to remember that this is all about what we're doing for the public. It's not just about us as researchers or our jobs or whatever. That is just the first issue before we talk about the actual impact that this research has.
Well, thank you so much, Courtney, Mark, and Brandi. This was a really illuminating and incredibly necessary conversation. We're already 2 minutes over time, so I just want to say, y'all will be back in the fall with the next season of this Digital Governance for Democratic Renewal webinar series. But this was really fantastic, a great way to close out the season. And so you can expect this video to be up on our YouTube channel in the next week or so. And please check out all of our work on Tech Policy Press's website, CWP's website, and CDPG's website. But once again, thank you, Courtney, Mark, and Brandi.